Washington and Moscow each possessed nuclear arsenals capable of destroying the world many times over. If they fired on one another directly, both sides would be vaporized. Because a direct war meant certain catastrophe, the superpowers viewed every unaligned country as a vital opportunity to expand their respective spheres of influence without pulling the nuclear trigger. They looked to the rest of the world to continue the struggle. Across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, local conflicts were absorbed into the global rivalry. Washington and Moscow poured weapons and money into these regions. Yet both nations repeatedly found they could not dictate the political outcomes they wanted. A strategy explicitly designed to protect the superpowers from total annihilation ended up inflicting decades of violence on developing nations. The first major deployment of conventional military might occurred in Korea. In 1950, American troops crossed the Pacific to push back communist forces, relying on overwhelming industrial production and heavy artillery. After 3 years of fighting, the border sat almost exactly where it began. The United States held the technological edge, yet the political status quo remained unchanged. Still, American policymakers feared that if one nation fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow in a chain reaction. That fear drove the United States into Vietnam. By the late 1960s, Washington had committed hundreds of thousands of combat troops, massive artillery batteries, and fleets of advanced aircraft to the Southeast Asian jungle. The enemy utilized guerrilla tactics, rendering traditional territory capture useless. As casualty numbers climbed and the political objective of a stable South Vietnam slipped away, domestic protests fractured American support for the war. In 1975, communist forces captured Saigon. A superpower equipped with the world's most advanced weapons had lost a war to a local resistance. To avoid another ground war, both superpowers began operating in the shadows. They deployed intelligence agencies to funnel cash, weapons, and tactical advisors to foreign groups, while keeping their own soldiers at home. This covert support flowed into post-colonial conflicts like the Civil War in Angola, turning local power struggles into heavily armed, multi-year campaigns. Local groups accepting superpower weapons often prioritized their own nationalistic goals over the strategic interests of Washington or Moscow, leaving the superpowers with little control over the violence they funded. In 1979, the Soviet Union moved away from covert tactics and deployed its own military into Afghanistan to protect a struggling communist government. The United States saw an opportunity. Instead of intervening directly, Washington routed weapons and funding through regional partners to the Afghan resistance fighters. The Soviet military secured the cities, but they could not eliminate the resistance in the mountains. The operations slowly drained Moscow's finances and eroded domestic morale over a decade of fighting. Attempting to steer global politics through foreign proxies exhausted the treasuries of both superpowers, while leaving third-world countries physically and economically shattered. Looking across the decades of proxy warfare, neither side achieved their broad strategic goals. The United States withdrew from Vietnam, and the Soviet Union eventually left Afghanistan. The human cost of these strategies is measured in the millions of civilians who were displaced or killed, and the long-term destabilization of dozens of nations. By the 1980s, Washington and Moscow recognized that the competition was moving away from physical territory in jungles and mountains. The immense defense spending of the era had accelerated research into satellite technology, global communications, and advanced computing. While the centralized Soviet economy struggled to keep pace with these innovations, America's technological sector was rapidly expanding and commercializing. The Cold War survived its proxy phase, only to pivot toward a competition of economic capacity. The question was no longer who could win on a battlefield, but who could afford to keep pace with the accelerating cost of technology.